I know you loosened it,
So, hello, how are you? So my presentation is on Afrocentric method for reading comprehension, critical thinking, and English composition. The significance of our research is that in sort of doing this sort of fly by the seat of my pants experiment, I started to consider that not only could reading comprehension, critical thinking, and for that matter, English composition be great for humanities courses, which are really focused on English, but that in all of your respective classes that require research papers, critical thinking, and of course, reading and review of research articles, the skill development that students engage in will be helpful as well. So I wanted to start by really focusing on the problem statement. And the problem is that students generally have an inability to read for comprehension, vocabulary development, exercise of critical thinking, and foresight into possible research composition. And it presents a significant barrier to the educational development and demonstration of knowledge, skill, and ability that they actually have. And it's more significant that it's usually not necessarily at the level of what we require of bachelor's degrees, much less the preparation for graduate studies. This presents a larger issue because as more people secure bachelor's degrees, graduate degrees, but don't have the type of critical thinking skill that the market really demands, it diminishes the value of awarding a degree that people are not able to live up to or not able to perform to the standard of. And so the idea is to focus on these areas as potential opportunities for improvement. So my needs statement. Students need access to a formula that contextualizes information into relatable fundamentals that they can actually understand and expand from their own perspective. They need a more expansive vocabulary, so the verbal repertoire becomes a tool that they are able to utilize beyond just addressing code switching. So we oftentimes at Allen University talk about code switching, the transition from informal language use to formal language use. However, if students do not have vocabularies, a vocabulary developed from a pretty robust verbal repertoire, they have nothing to transition from and nothing to necessarily transition to beyond just the basic use of informal language. So if informal language use is the only vocabulary that they have and they don't have a more formal language use to transition to, there is no code switching that can occur. All right? Students must develop research skills as a fundamental, as the desire to know information and engage methods to gain access to that information. So in my class, and it's only for my class, as I respect the pedagogy that each of you engage in respectively in your own classes, I actually allow students to utilize Google to access information. So if students are reading a research article and they will murmur a word, short of pronouncing the word incorrectly, of which I'll provide them the correct pronunciation of the word, I'll ask them, do you know the meaning of the word? And usually they'll say, no. So then I'll say, okay, find out the meaning of the word. So it's not just reading for reading's sake, where you now just skip over words that you aren't familiar with, or you pronounce them, or you just say, and well, whatever, which is what students usually say. It's the accountability of being able to read for comprehension, which means that you need to understand the words that people are using and the etymology of that word to understand why that word is more appropriate than other words. Students need to be able to develop critical thinking skills. Thus, a statement like, I don't know, is unacceptable in my class. I oftentimes challenge students that say, I don't know, to say, well, you're at an educational institution, like, you should endeavor to find out. So how would you go about finding out? You know, and so I relate a lot of things to just what they experience informally in just everyday life, because oftentimes what we really are doing is providing formal context, terminology around things that otherwise are just in the everyday lived experience that students have, but students aren't making those types of connections. But when they make those types of lived experiential connections, they better understand the information and feel more comfortable with it. last but not least, students need to be oriented or reoriented out of a context of educational trauma. And that educational trauma is really evident through concerns of sounding dumb. I don't want to look dumb. I don't want to sound dumb. People think I'm dumb, or my grades reflect something that is otherwise not considered to be academically astute. And so it creates for these self-esteem issues that cause students to shrink. I observe it in like their body language. I hear it in the types of terms that they choose to use when they're speaking about themselves, and to some degree, even when they're speaking about others. It's a fear of saying or even writing the wrong answer. So I really try to remove this context of punitive circumstance or consequence from the equation of classroom learning. So the purpose of the presentation is to create awareness among faculty of a shift in classroom pedagogy and andragogy. Andragogy is the idea of teaching adult students. It's not just pedagogy for pedagogy's sake. It's not just teaching for teaching's sake, but we oftentimes know that despite the fact that many of our students look very young, some of our students are actually past 25 years old. And so they are more than well qualified to be considered adults. And understanding that we are dealing with adult learners, it warrants that our pedagogy reflects something that is more appropriate to the audience that we now have. It encourages a similar African-centered method as learning reinforcement. Now, the caveat to this is, if you're not African-centered, how do you teach from an African-centered perspective? Well, it means that you have to understand the cultural nuance of what that actually entails in terms of a method. So, I'm going to explain to you what the method is. It's very simple, very easy. Now, how does this actually affect a student who may not be African-centered? Well, if you have black skin, we could generalize, although I don't oftentimes recommend it, but we could generalize that you are likely to be oriented in some way, shape, or form to either some aspect of functional or dysfunctional black culture. Generally, we can make that assumption and be pretty accurate. There are exceptions whereby if you have black skin or otherwise your racial identity is black, right? You could, in fact, be oriented culturally in an Asian culture of some sort, a European culture of some sort. And that is also a possibility. But in my particular instance, I have two students who are Caucasian males who will say, I don't really understand Afrocentric method. And my response to them, very candidly, is, welcome to the wonderful world of what black people experience on a regular basis when we are at predominantly white institutions trying to acquire an education that is out of our own cultural context. So, what I recommend for them is to not focus on utilizing Afrocentric method, but to utilize the standard educational methods for reading comprehension, writing, etc., that they have traditionally utilized. And so, my level of teaching in that regard is sort of status quo. It's to the standard by which we generally have been taught across the board. Even for me at Howard University, there's just a general standard of sort of what gets framed as Eurocentric pedagogy that we automatically acquire as a type of default because of Eurocentricity's universalism. But in an Afrocentric context, it considers that at a historically black university, there have to be methods that are appropriate to teach students that are of a particular cultural background, imagining that that cultural orientation will create a context for familiarity. The example that I'll use in the context of discussing this type of method as a way to heal educational trauma is that when you ask students something like, what is the room that you otherwise entertain your guests in at your home? You all would say, what?
Living room.
Living room. Den. And that answer is wrong. The general answer that, at least for IQ exams, is that it's the great room. The problem with that being the right answer is that that right answer is oriented in social class, and it's oriented in a particular type of cultural experience that is otherwise considered racially white, but culturally Eurocentric, European-centered. And so, to invalidate students' experience by saying that if they say den or living room is incorrect is to then suggest a type of marginalization of their own intelligence and the irrelevance of their own experience as something that they can bring to the table that otherwise is accurate to what it is that they would know and understand. And so this idea of having a culturally oriented context of being able to then explain to students one group of people's great room is the otherwise same function and purpose as your living room. Understand that the two are synonymous, but different people call it different things based upon social class, time, location, etc. All right? So then students are like, oh, okay, like, I get it. So now I have a way of understanding that if somebody says great room, they're talking about otherwise what's my living room or what's my den. Or maybe we just don't have that because me, my mother, and my brothers and sisters stay in a one-bedroom home. Like, it affects the context by which students see themselves, and it affects this idea of trauma in the orientation of a person's sense of self-esteem in the classroom. So what is Afrocentric method? There are 5 general characteristics that Molefi Asante actually describes as Afrocentric method. I sort of stumbled upon this idea of taking what I use as a research method and just simplifying it into an approach that students would otherwise be able to use. But in essence, the method considers that no phenomenon can be apprehended adequately without locating it first. What does this mean? It just means that you have to be able to analyze a thing in relationship to the psychological time-space dimensions that exist. That it is always a matter of locating it, but more importantly, investigating, or as I sort of put, I describe this to my students as researching it in the complexity of its interrelationships between science, art, design, execution, creation, maintenance, generation, tradition, but even more importantly, things as imaginative structure of economic systems, politics, policy of government, expression of cultural form, expression of culture in the form of attitude, beliefs, behaviors, language, text, institution. These are all areas that are relevant to your respective areas of expertise and subjects that you actually teach. Third, it considers the phenomenon to be diverse, dynamic. So how do I articulate this? I articulate this to students as an examination of phenomenon, namely in the context of just social context. So what's the social phenomenon? What are the social conditions that are actually being affected by what it is that an article may be discussing or talking about? It is, in essence, the method of forming cultural criticism. So that examines the etymological use of words. Why are we using certain words? This here then becomes the development of a vocabulary list that I require students to create and to expand throughout the course of a semester, referring back to words, requiring that they use words now as part of their own sentence structure, as part of their own research papers, as a way to now expand their verbal repertoire and get them to now pronounce and sound out words on their own, look up the definitions, understand the origins of those words, that they have appropriate, applicable use. It's looking at the intersection of ideas and actions, and with those actions, trying to understand what are some of the pejorative or ineffective aspects of that, as well as the more effective and uplifting aspects of it, both in transformatively political, social, and economic methods. Last but not least, it seeks to uncover and unmask the rhetoric of power, privilege, and position. And so what I oftentimes explain to students is that you can not only use Afrocentric method to examine text, but rhetoric in any context is simply the mode of talking about communication. So when I use the word rhetoric, I'm really just referring to a more antiquitous aspect of how the term otherwise just articulates communication. But one of the things that I find interesting is that generally across the board, except for in Africana studies or African American rhetoric textbooks, the general definition for rhetoric is that it aims to inform, but more importantly, persuade an audience, which is why you oftentimes hear political rhetoric oriented in this context where information sort of gets skewed or facts are sort of slain, if you will, for the purpose of just persuading an audience. But I also remind my students that from a culturally oriented standpoint, black rhetoric otherwise aims to bring about this idea of nomo, this idea of spiritual force that's accompanied by yet another spiritual force, which is magara, which is a life force that brings about this aspect of truth, harmony, and balance. So you speak for the purpose of promoting truth, harmony, balance, orienting oneself in the context of something that is meaningful and purposeful. So one of the things that I'll do, because I sort of see it in here, is that as I speak, I notice people's head nodding. it's an aspect of this call and response that occurs both verbally and non-verbally as students are able to then take not only text, but also the observation, the visual observation of body language as a nonverbal means of rhetoric or communication, and be able to use Afrocentric method to make the same types of assessments that they make otherwise, even for things that are in text. So what does this really mean? So the breakdown for students is that I say that Afrocentric method is about time and error. It's about location. It's about phenomenon. It's about the etymology of words, and it's about the mode or method of delivery. So in this particular article, it's for my hip-hop class, and I've used it for my English class. It's manifestations of Afrocentricity in hip-hop. The idea is that as students are transitioning through paragraphs, students will first look at a document and they'll say, oh, I got to do all of this reading. I don't know what I'm going to do. So then they'll just say, well, to just get it over with and to be able to say that I read, I'll just read through it. And then you ask them, what did they read? And they'll be like, I don't know. It's not acceptable. It's an exercise of futility, right? And so instead, what I have students do is take the left column and I'll say, if you sort of created a legend where 1, 2, 3, 4 have now these, and 5 have associated properties, you can go in and say, over the course of 3 decades. So now when students see things like 3 decades, they immediately know that they're looking at time and error, right? When they see things like examine African American rhetoric, scant, they say, oh, well, scant becomes a vocabulary word that I need to understand. So now we're looking at the etymology of a word. When we're talking about the entire context of why something like this is significant, what is the purpose behind looking at the manifestations of Afrocentricity in rap music? It's because it changes the social discourse of rap music being something that is otherwise degrading and looks at now rap music as something that is inherently black culture, if you will. And so to understand the social conditions that exist around pejorative language use that otherwise marginalizes this aspect of rap music in a vacuum, opposed to allowing rap music or any other aspect of black culture to be looked at in a broader, comprehensive context, establishes a circumstance of social condition which would otherwise be a type of phenomenon that's actually occurring throughout this particular document, or that the document is trying to address. So this really provides sort of the breakdown, and although this is probably my horrible chicken scratch that, God forbid you look at, I do things in class like, I'll say, well, what's the definition of scant? And nobody will say anything, and I'll just use my phone because my phone is typically programmed to respond to me, so I'll say, hey Siri, and my phone will typically respond, and I'll say, what's the definition of scant? And then Siri will start reading to me the definition of scant. It amazes me that students will use Snapchat, their phones for video recording fights. They use all this type of technology for dysfunctional purposes, but they don't use it for educational purposes. And the primary reason is because they haven't been programmed to use it for educational purposes. So it behooves us, or at least in my mind, I believe it becomes my responsibility as I engage them as freshmen and sophomore to prepare them for your classes. So that as you give them articles, and I remind them constantly that this is a graduate level article. So if you find it difficult to read, you should find it difficult to read because this is an article that is not oriented for undergraduates. However, I'm having you read it because as you prepare for whatever your endeavors may be, this is the level of standard that you should become familiar with. So let's start working with this as it stands so that once you sort of cut your teeth on this, everything else from that point is a matter of just learning enhancement, not trying to be adapted to the fundamentals. So the results. So now at just half the semester, I have students who are more willing to think through their responses. They use Afrocentric method to say, well, what's the time frame of this? And because they're asking themselves these questions now as they read these different research articles from Melbourne Cummings and Arabic Roy to Geneva Smitherman talking about language, and imaginably even articles that you guys will produce in your classes, they are able to then think through and dissect, comprehend on their own conclusions, which gives them a type of confidence to engage work opposed to trying to sort of gloss over work or run away from work and then want to only utilize you for all of the answers. They learn how to be independent thinkers. Students decrease in the frequency of I don't know, and at least for my class, they just go straight to Siri and they'll just say, I already know you're going to tell me to Google it, so I Googled it already. So I'm like, exactly, that's what I want you to do. Or somebody will say one thing, they'll say, oh, the definition is this. And somebody else will say, yeah, but you know what? I looked up another definition and I think the more applicable definition is this. And so they'll start to debate with each other about what the context of a definition of a word should actually be in the application of a particular article. Those things become critical because it fosters not only a learning environment, but a circumstance where students start to utilize each other as resources to learn and acquire information, which I hope transitions out even outside of the classroom. Students investigate reading, for the occurrence of more than one method. So originally it started out that students were just looking at the occurrence of one method occurring in one paragraph at one time and calling it a day. But now they look at the multi-dimension of how one method can actually occur several times in a paragraph or in an entire research document, and they start to articulate that. They demonstrate improved ability to summarize overarching themes and the context of an article, which is really the evidence of comprehension. I have to tell you, I have not had students start to write out papers yet, but as they haven't started to write out papers, one of the things that I've also seen is that the educational trauma is decreased because I have students who are more willing to engage, who now are trying to find their voice, who are interested in now being able to say, I want to be able to use a research article for the composition of my research paper. And that's significant because now there's this desire that they have to engage things that we otherwise, introduce sort of haphazardly, that just seems like it's an overwhelming task for students. But students are now able to give me the 5 steps that include the process of going into JS Flipper Library online, accessing EBSCOhost, clicking on peer-reviewed articles in EBSCOhost, and being able to then conduct their search, knowing that they have empirical evidence to support much of their argument. And so that's my use of Afrocentric method for my class.
Because I have one of them.
Yes.
I just want to thank you for this. Because most of the time we teach our students at a level that is very much below who they are. I always say to students, you are in an academic world. You are no more in high school. The academic world starts with BSc. And you have to train these students to be able to get on to the, to a graduate level.
Yes.
And be able to compete with the people in there. I have my students, because when I come in, I tell my students, I don't have to draw that man standing like this to tell you that the man is standing on one leg. I will not. I will not. I give you the stuff that I feel you need to know.
Yeah.
You may not want to answer questions. You may not want to speak to me, but I will be answering your questions. I'll be giving you examples. I'll be dancing and jumping, but it has to be academics. Yes. I'm glad you brought this up so that we learn to teach our students that they are in academic world.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
And I just make one comment. Well, I actually got a lot of backlash for this. I've been doing this since I first got here. I never answered questions from day one. Never. What we do next? And I got and I spent my time to write the whole lab down. I don't answer those type of questions. So they complained about me when I first got here. They don't do it anymore, but now they're learning that, and the thing with the Google. Ask Mr. Google man. They know that's what I say all the time. You can ask Mr. Google man. Don't ask me.
Yep. It's important, especially when more than one professor is teaching in that particular style. They start to understand that there's, I have students who have Ms. Hayward after my class, and if I go over in time, they are like, look, I will get hemmed up. And I appreciate that because it tells me that she set a standard that students know that timeliness is important. And so how could I ever argue against that? I'm like, oh yeah, you gotta get going because she'll hit me up too. So I'm very clear about that, and so it feels great to have that type of.
I also appreciate the aspect of trying to inculcate the critical thinking. Like students like asking, is this correct? Is this right? The answer is, I don't know. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Some students don't even, well,
So I
think, oh, yeah, but people in general, I think, some people in general, like, just, I guess where I should keep it in context of Alex, but, like, the respect for the time thing, like, nobody really has that here. Oh, wow. You see? Like, I mean, not that it's been my experience that people just don't really value other folks' time. Just generally speaking. And so I think that's where, the students might see that and pick up on it. Like, oh, I can just roll in at this time.
Which is actually one of the reasons why I usually try to demonstrate like some type of relationship that I have with other professors. So even if students are talking bad about a professor, I'll interrupt them and I'll be like, oh, that's my colleague that you're talking about. Like, so I don't want to hear that aspect of the conversation, because when they know that we are divided, they operate accordingly. But when they know that they couldn't say, something crazy about, Ms. Hayward or Dr. Washington or Dr. Rito, they know that there's this orientation of connectedness even among faculty where, despite being in different departments, there's this idea of understanding and mutual respect.
We did a good job.
Thank you everybody for coming around.
And I want to ask you, man,
All right.